one will be fine. Okay, so we're trying to get out. So. Thank you very much. Yes. Given an opportunity to say that. Yes. Thank you very much for being here with us this evening. Thank you everybody who's going to watch it later online. And thank you both for our speaker, Joe Davis, who has been with us for since the very beginning. So this is actually your center as much as it is ours. So this is a great opportunity to introduce somebody who's a direct research associate to SOAS. So this is actually a SOAS member for a SOAS center. So this is everybody else who's not SOAS, you're very, very welcome. But because we've had such a problem retaining Africa as a center, this is a genuine problem. It's a financial problem. It's we have been very keen here at the CWC to host programs, seminars, get speakers from various parts of Africa and on African themes. So this is something that will also be continuing next year. So this is maybe a little bit of a counterweight to the tendency that we have. So Joe, those of you who know your work, there's very little that I can do to compliment on it and compliment actually what you've been writing and publishing yourself. But you're certainly one of the most representative SOAS creatures in the way that you actually respect the original languages.
Oh, this is a friend of mine.
Oh, yeah.
I just sent him the link.
So we have yes. So we will fix everything else later. So so once again, thank you for being here. Thank you also for watching this later. If you want, if there are any queries that you have to our speaker, then I'm sure we can either through the center or through a direct email. Maybe you can give that later. We can see to the best possible explanation of any questions that you may have. So without further ado, I would like to pass the word to Joe.
Thank you so much, Lars. It is wonderful to be here and to present for the Center for World Christianity, which is my home house, on today's subject, which is a literary issue in black and white, Southern African.
I presume we'll get some.
We need to put the PowerPoint on as well.
Yes.
Go back to speaker and then.
And is the recording on?
I think the recording is on.
The recording's on, yeah.
There we go. Good. Thank you, guys. You're so brave. Clicking buttons is not as easy as it used to be. So to move them, I'll just press down. Okay.
Yes, yes.
So so good evening, everybody, and welcome to this seminar. I'm so pleased to share with you several indicative letters written by a huge community in the southeastern region of South Africa in the 18th and 19th centuries, and to share also some of my research and thoughts on these letters. So just to situate ourselves, thank you. Move the wrench entirety. Just to switch up, so the letters I'm going to talk to you about today are written by Jan Carolus, whose works were published in the transcriptions of the London Missionary Society and written before 1800. Jacobus Scholz, with 4 different names, spellings, whose letters are in the special collections downstairs. Catherine Dorothea Fortuyn, whose letters were published in the Evangelical magazine. Willem Fortuyn, also called William Peter, also in the Evangelical magazine, dear me. Sarah Fortuyn, Marta Arendse, Wilhelmina Stompius, Jan Tsatsu, and Cupido. And this is the spelling of his name, which is actually on the one letter of his downstairs in special collections, but it's not in his hand. So it's still a question on the spelling of that name, but that's the one I use because that's the one I've seen. So, but just before we start going into the letters, I just want to quickly refresh, have a look at a couple of maps because the early 18th century is a rather rarefied zone. And just to say that at the time, the Cape Colony was only this bit here that's shaded in. You can see Cape Colony in 1710. So we are looking at a Cape Colony which is extremely tiny. By 1834, which is 15 years after, or 16 years after I'm talking about, the colony extended up to the Fish River here, and what the significant amount of land had been taken. This is a close-up of the Cape Colony as it was then. This map is from 1726. And what's interesting as well is that these names here are the names of peoples who are living in the region at the time. And this map shows the high number of mission stations that arrived even before 1828. This area was the second most proselytized region in the world after the South Pacific, according to Richard Price, whose work I routinely quote, because in fact, by the end of the 1880s, that is how many mission stations were resident in the Southern African. That doesn't include Zimbabwe, Namibia. This goes to the top of Johannesburg, and I'm going to talk today about Kuruman, which is now in this part here is actually still in South Africa today. So this map is actually missing a few stations as well. My home version of this has at least 30 stations that I've found in the last 15 years that are not on this map. And again, very important to remember that this area is in the 17th century and 18th century, densely populated. There are people everywhere. There is not a single spare bed in the whole of Bethlehem. It is totally populated as a region. And the area that I'm going to be talking to you about today, particularly, is this bit here between the Hottentot Hollands, which is a type of a mountain range, into the Eastern Cape. And you can see all these mission stations that are black are London Missionary Society mission station. And they stretch up to Hefteba and then up to Ditakong and Kuruman. And so this is the region in which this literary production took place in the 18th century and into the 19th century. And what's important as well is that not only is this highly densely populated, but it's also very quick to get from place to place. On average, it would take the most it would take was 4 hours to travel between one and another place. You would be able to leave by 8 and be there by 11 in general. And people did leave at 8 in the evening and get there at 11 in the night as well. So it's very, very easy to move around. It's not remote. There are not outposts that no one knows about. People can move quite quickly, firstly, except for if they were going up to Kuruman or Ditakong, in which case it would take 2 days. Between 1816 and 1818, these two stations of Hefziba and Toverberg, also called Toenberg, and about 3 other names, were established, and they broke that journey up to 1 day. So that means that letters could move around within a day and get back to post boxes and so on. It was not a typical frontier of, expanses of nothing where like a letter was going to take 3 years. It's a completely different situation I've discovered. So the other people who were living in this area at the time were the descendants of Dutch farmers. And not only was it highly populated by all people, but also by these people who had come to live there in an extremely violent manner. And one, Martin Legassic, whose work I use a lot, notes that one should not exaggerate. The major crime of white expansion was the almost complete dispossession of the indigenous Khoi inhabitants of their territory and property. And this is very important for the letters that we're going to look at. Another major crime, in my opinion, was that it begat a genocide. The Boers were constantly going on hunting parties to murder any and all Southern Africans they surprised. Those in indentured labor were beaten and abused, killed, maimed, raped. The violence represented in the court cases brought by the farmers, by the Missionary Society, or by then London Missionary Societies from as early as 1808, I believe, through Reverend James Reed Sr., is really difficult to understand. The violence is so totalizing. It's extremely difficult to understand, and it underpins everything I'm doing here in today's work and in my old work. It is highly distressing, and it carries trigger warnings for the insane details. I'm not going to give them in this talk, but if you ever do go and look at it, be warned, it's seriously tragic. And the names also are given to peoples, for they are seldom Shinakwa, Hesekwa, Burikwa, or Damasqua. They are pejorative terms. I've tried to minimize them, as I'm of the opinion that republishing is an enactment of violent speech acts. However, I do understand that this sanitizing and whitewashing has implications, and this is a topic I'm very, very keen to discuss for other perspectives. However, they still do appear, these pejorative terms, throughout my work in this paper, throughout my work in this era, and I do apologize wholeheartedly for their use. I don't know how else to deal with them. So the next generation on from this very early writing group, the 1820s, are from the 1820s on in this region, were adept wordsmiths, renowned for their public petitioning and for writing memorials. They were even called memorialists. And memorials were chronologies of events and resolutions taken to be rid of these very murderous activities. Oh, there's my husband. To be rid of these very murderous activities in the belief that it would safeguard their rights. Their sophisticated literary skills are almost taken for granted. Lars Atkins writes in this book, Writing the South African San, that Adam Koch II was not alone in mobilizing the humanitarian discourse of protection to bolster his claims to legitimate authority in these contested borderlands during the 1820s. Hendrik Hendricks, who lived from 1795 to 1881, petitioned directly to British administrators and Anglo-Dutch settler elites to two extraordinary letters published in the South African Commercial Advertiser in 1830 and in the Cape of Good Hope Observer of 1849. Indeed, this extraordinary pen personship extended beyond the political to the biblical. By the 1820s, notes Elizabeth Elborn, actually Jared MacDonald quoting in this book, quoting Elizabeth Elborn in Blood Ground, that by the 1920s, biblical literacy was widespread amongst the Khoisan. In fact, education programs as part of Society for All, and specifically at mission stations, were so commonplace that the Reverend John Phillip would deliver a sermon in 1828 entitled The Importance of Early Instruction, a sermon for the benefit of the South African Infant School Society. And when it came to research on this generation, the preceding generation, one surprising conclusion was that people at this time also had an extremely high level of literacy. They penned these letters with frequency and aplomb. They were a way of communicating with their contemporaries in the world mission. In 1796, the Moravians in the region wrote, on the 6th, which day is specifically set apart in the congregations of the brethren as a day of prayer and thanksgiving for the work of God among heathen nations, of which also accounts are communicated. On the 6th day, we prayed the litany with the baptized Hottentots, and in another meeting communicated some accounts from Greenland. We wish to have accounts from other missions translated into Low Dutch to read to our people. 1796. For our verbal account of our Saviour's work amongst the other heathen nations excited great attention and much joy among them, especially when we told them that on this day prayers are up in all our congregations in their behalf. Demand creates supply. The target communities themselves had an appetite for this content, and it is this global network which I believe these letters in the main tap in different ways. And these authors wanted to take their place on this world stage, in my opinion. The editors of the missionary periodicals at this time are also fairly desperate for content. It must be noted, a number of editorials requesting people to send in suitable content, especially in the turn of the 18th century. The missionary periodicals are all new, so they're wanting to establish and keep their readers, and they're working hard. Please send in any suitable content, they say. On a broad social note, newspapers across Britain for this epoch carried regular updates on the Southern African region because their army garrisons were stationed there. Sons and brothers, fathers and uncles were in this situation, and the press provided communities for their feedback for their communities. So there was also a globalized literacy about Southern Africa. It wasn't quite as remote as we contemporarily assume. So that by way of a very long introduction. The first two letters, which I would like to show you, I'm not sure how it is going. Let me click them anymore. Oh, there we go. Okay. The first two letters are letters that I'm not going to talk about below. They're written by Young and Carolus. Both Southern African writers whose letters I retrieved as part of my research on the presence of Southern African voices within Victorian missionary periodicals. Imagine my surprise when in the very first edition of the Transactions, these letters from Southern Africans appeared. They were translated by an unnamed person from Dutch to English. And in a paper that I wrote about this, I argued that their voices are legible as redolent of self. That's not what I'm going to be talking about today, but if you ever want to ask me any questions, I'm always very happy to talk about it. In the last part of the letter, the PX up at the top that's published on the next page, Carolus identifies himself as an interpreter and as a translator. He says, I let you know that I am the interpreter of the Bosheman, the language of which I understand better than the Archival. In other words, these are both second languages to him. I forgot to say that I, who am interpreter of the people, tell them how they can be helped. Oh, how afraid I am, lest I should not make up to myself. And now, because Carolus identifies himself as this translator, I began to search the original files at Special Collections in case the hard copy original was in the holdings. In contemporary world Christianity studies, translators are key to continued research. This sparked a careful read of all holdings to do with his ears, line by line, page by page, language by language. Although I did not find them yet, I did find others. And I also found these letters, these very same letters had been included in the Evangelical magazine of 2 years previously, in May 1801. They'd been written in, I estimate them in 1799. That is the year I estimate they'd been written. The July issue of 1801 also referred to an interpreter named Carolus, spelled with a C, who is possibly a different person. I'm definitely not going to say the one, it's a spelling mistake. Until I know for sure there isn't another Carolus with a C, I have to say there's possibly more than one. Meaning that their global reach was even more impactful than just with the LMS magazine, because now they're being published in 2 missionary journals, periodicals, they're reaching even more people. The Evangelical magazine from May 2 years later included 2 letters from another Southern African couple called CD or Catherine Dorothy. Oh, sorry, here's another reference to Carolus in the Transactions, specifically as an interpreter, and here as another interpreter called Somkinki, whose name I've never seen again. So there are, through these periodicals, there are small clues that allow us to trace what's happening with the word work. Here are the letters from Catherine and William Peter, you can see here, also called Willem Pieter Volsheim. Now, they're working with the then Missionary Society as wagon drivers, translators, and lay preachers. And it's Catherine who is the translator here. She is the one who is able to speak both the Dutch and the Bosheman's language. And here we have a quote from Mr. Kitcherer, who says, "We have a woman who could speak both the Dutch and Bosheman language so that we can communicate to them the blessed gospel." So here is this woman, and in other documents I have, I know they're specifically talking about Catherine. So I just want to jump back to the letter quickly to say, she writes, "I let you know that at the last sacrament, I had a particular impression of the love of our Lord Jesus Christ. Previous to my drawing near unto the board, I labored under an oppressive sense of all my sins. But when at the table, partaking of the tokens of his flesh and blood, I felt that the Lord Jesus took upon himself all my sins. Nay, through grace, I could believe that my sins were done away from eternity. Every word, my dear Master Kitcherer had spoken to me, the Lord Jesus has blessed to my soul. And we hope the Lord will bring our dear Master back to us. Kitcherer is in Europe at the time. For I long much to see your face. Moreover, I take the liberty of telling you that the Lord converts many people at Rodesant, which proves the greatest comfort and support, as it seems here that the time is now come, when the Lord shall pour out his blessing over the whole world and draw all poor sinners unto himself. Accept my cordial love to you, dear sir. Oh, I wish that the dear Lord may always be with my dear Master. Please give my love to Mary, John, and Martha. All my children are well. We live at Mr. Bligman's, and through God's mercy do very well. Your most humble servant, C.D. Fortuyn." So there are a number of intriguing things that we can immediately start talking about in the letters, which I'm not going to talk about today because that has to do with literary production, voice, access to vocality, redolence of self, all these kinds of issues which drive me as a literary theorist the most. But there are other. I just need you to think of what her voice is doing, how her voice is saying. And here we have another Fortuyn. She mentions, "Give my love to Mary, John, and Martha." The next Fortuyn to appear in the evangelical magazine was Sarah, also spelled Sarah, possibly a relative, maybe a sister. Although she appears predictably as Mary, the wife of John traveling with Martha in the 1803 visit of 3 Southern African converts to Europe, so carefully if partially rendered in Elizabeth Elburn's Blood Ground. Her name even appears twice in a letter requesting passport applications to allow her and her traveling companions, given as Martha Arendse and Klaas van Roy, not John, to Europe. They're in Holland when this letter comes through. And you can see her name is spelled, as are all three of those, twice on the document. Here she's Sarah, here she's Sarah with an H, Martha Arendse, and Klaas. And here it looks like it says Klaas van Story, but it's actually apparently Klaas van Roy. But it definitely looks to me like it doesn't say Roy there, it says Story. So equivocations on what his actual name was and how we report that. In 1803, an article on these three converted Hottentots appeared when they publicly appeared to discuss the truth and grace of God in the evangelical magazine for 1803. And it gives their answers before a religious committee to questions on their spiritual knowledge. And this entire document is repeated in the minutes of questions and answers for these three travelers in the evangelical magazine 2 months later. This group also went to see the king at St. James with the president of the Royal Society, that was Howes. And so their story is very well documented. I'm not going to stick further on this for longer, other than to say in July 1807, we get another letter, a letter referred to here from Mary, the Hottentot, who with her husband John and Martha reside with Mr. Kitcherer, behaved in a good Christian manner. A letter has been received from her, and it's not they often speak of England, the kind is shown them here with great affection and gratitude. The letter is not reproduced, but in the next month, in August, here is a letter from now a woman called Mary van Rooij, who is now signaling, this name is signaling her marriage to this man. And again, there's this extremely high sense of, you know, reverence coming through in the Christian voice. In 1814, Campbell writes that he's seen them and that they're all still alive, but Klaas was said to be murdered shortly afterwards. And it's kind of like a weird textual happening. A number of people are said to have been murdered shortly afterwards in a number of situations. They rock up in the archives 15 years later doing other things. So whenever I hear that someone is said to be murdered shortly afterwards, I always say, he's on holiday in Malawi, back when he's ready, you know. So the illusion of her name belies the fact that she's a married woman. Her surname is Fortuyn. So with her married name, I beg your pardon, the illusion of that sort of truncates her connection with the Fortuyn family, who is quite clearly, which is quite clearly an important family in the history of Christianity in this region. So the fourth traveller who's travelling with them, who's never ever mentioned, aside from myself in one paper before. Oh, here are her letters, sorry, their letters from 1811. These letters are written in Dutch. You can see Maria S. van Rooij. I think that might also be a story somehow. They've written to say that the children are at the Great River with Jans. And the next letter is, so this one is written by Marta Arendse, also in Dutch, in their own hand. And this is how they're attached. So when you hit them in the archive, they're actually, it's very difficult to work out what's happening because they've been bound in a different way. So unless you can read the Dutch, which I luckily can, it's going to be very confusing. But so they're in together in one folder. And this is the English translation is with them in that folder. And you can see clearly it's not the same hand, but this hand is a hand that pops up quite regularly. So as soon as we can identify whose hand this is, we'll be able to work out who's translating. So there they are. The translation. And this is a picture that was made of Mary, Martha, John, and apparently Kitchener. But the fourth person who's part of this mission to Europe in 1803 is Mr. Jacobus Scholz, a native whom Kitchener has baptized. And this comes from the transactions from its institution in the year 1795. It's from 1799, the letter. There's Jacobus before the turn of the 18th century.
Jo, you just go on. Could you just go back to that picture and what's the source of that in that same file, was it?
No. There are several references to this picture in the file because the portraits are made and there are others too. I have only ever seen one other.
Where did you find that?
This one comes from a book from a theorist called Schumann, Karl Schumann, S-C-H-O-E-N-O-N.
You'd say Schumann.
Schumann, with whom I am completely in love, but unfortunately he has died. And also, you know, I have another life. His work is excellent, and he has sourced this. And you're preempting me to say something that comes at the end of the paper.
Yes.
No, it's fine. I'll put it here. To say these archives are dispersed, and one of the difficult issues is that Schumann has access to archives that are around the Kurman area and the Johannesburg region, where I am using special collections downstairs, and so I'm trying to combine them.
Yes.
The special collections has a number of these portraits do rock up because they've cost money and nobody knows where they are, and some are meant to be sent to so and so and so. So they are a subject And as I say, I have seen one other photo once of these, and I didn't have the mechanisms to record that picture at the time.
It's an amazing picture.
Isn't it? Yeah. It's in blood ground. Elizabeth Albon also have. I think she has it. Okay. So, and this is where they're answering questions. So here comes Jacobus, sorry, who again writes these insane numbers of letters. The reason that he is invisible in the archives, here he's writing from Holland, he's gone back to to Holland, they move between around, is that he has he becomes ill on his journey out here, and he's almost certainly going to die. Kitcher's brother, a man called Charles, does die, and Jacobus Scholz does not. And that is the subject of some of the letters, actually. But what I would like to draw your attention to the most is to see the steady, even hand from 1806, from 1801, highly educated, absolutely confident, absolutely no question about, how important it is to, the difficulties around literacy are completely debunked. In the Council for World Mission Archives, Scholz is treated as clergy. He's referred to as Kitcher's companion, and in other documents as Brother Scholz. Yet remarkably, unlike these three converts whose ethnicity is constantly invoked, his ethnicity is never mentioned in the letters generated around his health and recovery, or in any of the other letters he writes. The last letter in the library downstairs is penned in 1816, for some reason isn't here. And then I think that further documentation of his will be found in the South African Missionary Society archives in South Africa, and really that's the next stage to go, because he's active until well into the 1850s as a person in that milieu. So I think I'm tracing the same person. I hope we'll see when I get there. He writes in English and Dutch with beautiful handwriting in an even steady hand. His exact history within the South African Missionary Society is a site for further exploration. The first implication of this research is to acknowledge that Dutch is the language of the contact zone in Southern Africa, at least for the 60 years between 1736 and 1794. Even after the LMS arrived in 1797, these missionaries were predominantly Dutch, even until around 1810. Now, nowhere is this more legible than in these documents. The 50-page Lebenslaufs, or the two 50-page Lebenslaufs, or curriculums vitae penned by Wilhelmina Stompius, who lived between 1788 and 1863. If I can just tuck this Moravian archive material into the LMS subject. A Lebenslauf was written by Moravians at an age approaching a reasonable expectation of imminent death, which described the most important life data of the person concerned, specifically the conversion experience, religious life, and spiritual journey. An addendum written by the minister of the congregation is added after the person dies. Wilhelmina's accounts amount to an incredible woman's narrative. It is in Dutch, and I have mostly transcribed it. It is the wealth that it affords us is indescribable, the value incalculable. And actually, I don't own them in digital copy. I received them from Kieran Hood. If you're is watching, I know Kieran Hood. And they are page after page of printed Lebenslauf, and they are long. And they are printed, but they're also handwritten. And when this all happened in COVID, I was supposed to go, but the archivist said no, because they had to close and deep clean twice. They said, "You are not coming." I said, "Okay, fair enough." And this is what they look like in the hand copy, but they digitized them for me because the pages are so thin that they become like a palimpsest. Or the scanner doesn't know how to stop. So they sent me these ones instead. And there are many. There are so many. I can't even calculate them. all written by Southern Africans in Dutch. Here's the second by Wilhelmina Stompius, and here is one written by her husband, Karel Stompius, who's this man here. And this picture I found in Boerns PhD, Karel Stompia, husband of Wilhelmina Stompia. As I said, the information, would you like to have a look? Please do, but those are my only copies because they sent them to me on a one-time download link. And at that stage, I didn't think to copy them. And so I only have those copies.
You have to photograph them, scan them.
I know, I should. I haven't.
It's other archive duties.
Kind of Germanic.
I don't know if I'm allowed to. Actually, this is not difficult to read. It could be worse because it's not German, it's Dutch.
All right.
So it doesn't have any of those crazy B's, and there's no difference between the old and the new version. Anyway, time marches on. I'm worried about my information. So as I said, the wealth that it affords us is indescribable, the value incalculable. Moravians had been present in this region since 1736, almost a full century before the arrival of the Alamacs and Scottish Presbyterians, and intrepid and under-renowned George Schmidt had settled amongst the Hessequas, the tribe inhabiting the present Caledon district on the banks of the Zondereinde River. 6 years later, he returned to Europe under a sacramental dust cloud, leaving a fledgling Christian community for 50 years. Wilhelmina Stompus lived through Sorga's lifetime and is recorded as a closer translator and national assistant. We are visited by Reverend Theo Sorga, who is the subject of my main research, at least once. This is the research that led me to the Moravian archives initially. Born at a village at the foot of the Tumi River, which is exactly where Sorgi came from, she died beside it at the Moravian mission station of Silo. I think she wrote 2 Lebenslauf simply because she so outlived expectations after her first that she had to write a second. What does her voice say? What are her narrative devices? Metaphors. Wilhelmina Stompius is a very important South African figure with more than enough string data from which to draw numerous studies. She was not taught by George Schmidt. She's too old. So we need to also think of who taught her in approximately 1795 in and around the Tumi Valley. More Moravian missionaries resumed work at Genadendal in 1792. And here's a picture of it. Really a beautiful little town called both Babiaanskloof, which means baboons rift, and Genadendal, which means place of
Mercy, is it? Or
yeah,
Genasi?
Genade. It is Mercy.
Mercy, I think, yeah.
Mercy Dale. And
Frieda is peace, I think.
that's right. And they wanted to get rid of this association of baboon, obviously. So they changed from Babiaan to Genadendal. So the second group of people, and when they arrived, they found a woman baptized called Verhetge Tekaya or Verhetgin, baptized as Magdalena and called Helena and Lena. She still owned a Dutch New Testament, which another young woman would read to her. So there is a history of literacy which George Schmidt engendered in this, but Wilhelmina Stompius is not the same as Verhetge Tekaya, who has a chapter in this most beautiful book, digging up of this. There are
Is that Landman?
yes, it is.
Christina Landman.
Christina Landman. These two women's stories are sometimes enmeshed so that it looks like they're the same woman, but nobody lives for more than 100 years except in extremely peaceful situations, which these women are. So, so this is all about letters that we have specifically for this region in Dutch and in English. When it comes to the Khoi languages and vernacular representations, I don't actually have letters in those, but I do have, so here's the dagwoord. Oh, my slides are in the wrong order. Okay, so So what this points to is an extremely high level of literacy in this region. Where we have the first school, this is George Smith's school register.
Fantastic.
Name list,
Fantastic.
a name list from 1739 of the Hottentots who are with George Smith. This is not his orthography. And here you can see Archival, Kibido, Kubis, Bobishak, Matthias, and Janke Takaya. For Hetre's relation, her surname's also Takaya. Just stop for a second at Kibodo, because that then becomes important at a later stage. So he's keeping his registers, class lists, names and dates of attendees, names of teachers and their subjects. These kinds of roll calls were taken and made throughout the history of the LMS presence and Moravian presence in this region. And I surmise that it's because their narrative of progress was driving them to give some kind of proof of what they've been doing. This is all they could actually do, because their converts grew out of this group. And in the meanwhile, other than baking bricks and literally baking bricks to build houses with, there wasn't a lot to write about. So this was a subject that was quite exciting and attractive. So they read a lot of information about it. Right from this moment, missionaries offered instruction in literacy before and alongside Christianity. While the missionaries themselves lived in communities which they described and defined by racial categories, so you'd say, you know, so-and-so missionary to the Xhosa people or so-and-so missionary to the Hottentot people. In fact, the communities themselves were not monocultures, and people moved around, as I showed you, very, very easily. Within a couple of days, they could get anywhere and worship in each other's churches, attend each other's schools. Several populations moved regularly across this region, rendering pupil cohorts diverse in age, gender, ethnicity, and first language. School was offered to all, not as biblical classes, but as classes such as spelling. Schmidt reveals his struggles with obtaining the RBS books, in other words, just basic spelling books. And he reveals his struggles with teaching Dutch, not his growing experience of Hessequa languages. It's definitely Dutch down, not Hessequa up. And he starts talking about, you know, his pupils fairly regularly. There are other schools. In 1799, the missionaries say, this is Kitchener, he's gone to the house of Mr. van Salk, of Fribourg Constitution. He had about 300 Hottentots under his tuition, hope between 30 and 40 had truly received from saving grace to be faithful. And here also he had, Mr. Forst had a flourishing congregation. And with that congregation, you can assume there's a fair amount of literary information and education that's happening along, written literacy that's happening, predating that. So in Genadendal, the education there, the instruction just grew and grew and grew. In 1798, Cor Harmer reports you would hardly believe that at present 800 people live here, men, women, and children included, 700 of whom are in our care, some in the schools learning to read, and all under instruction in the truths of Christianity. Boone says that the document for the 1799 foundation stone of the new church building, including baptized, baptismal candidates, and instruction numbers, there were 250 school children. The highlighting and importance of the earliness of the date of the founding of the new church building belies that fact that it occurred only once the congregation had been operating for a long while. It is almost an antecedent glance, an analytic thing, a representation of a thing as existing after it actually did, which is a form of anachrony or disconcordance between the story and the narrative, which as a literary theorist, I'm always looking at how are the devices used to make things look more recent that in fact are much older. And this is one of the foundation stones as a moment of firstness hides behind. I actually call these writers the prequel to the vanguard, because they actually go before the vanguard. Anyway, this is a trope in the historiography of all these stations. The prequel is a congregation pre-existing any foundation stone, including with deacons and theological officials, women and men religious, if I may. For Sorga, that means the congregation with which he is dealing is almost 50 years old. They are the contemporaries of these 1799 group of teenagers, young people and children. In the middle of 1800, Van Kemp wrote that he was instructing 16 students of various ages and nations at Bettelsdorp. And there were 1,296 people under instruction in 1802. Here is where, there's more examples of how many students are being taught, and further examples of how students, this is Dorothy. We have lately lost a very useful woman whose name was Old Dorothy. Her father was a European. She was baptized when a child and could read and write. When brothers Anderson and Kramer came here, they found 5 whom she had taught to spell. A few weeks before her illness, she was received a member of our infant church. So these are the word workers involved in this situation. And surprisingly, there are a huge number of women involved. It seems almost a women's environment, especially when you move out of the 1820s and into the 30s and 40s, lots and lots of women. So, after Van der Kemp's third journey into Kaffrland, being a wandering journey in 1801 with some colonists and lasting from January to May, he had a long stay in Graaff-Reinet. And during this, the Hottentots, who had gathered there for protection from the Pulsars, pressed more and more upon his attention. Soon a vigorous work was being carried on among them, the children being instructed in spelling at a school presided over by Reed, and children and adults in the principles of Christianity. Numerous religious meetings were held, and a venue was found for all those in the Church of Graaff-Reinet. So this is where the Bettelsdorp institution commences, with Van der Kemp's stay in Graaff-Reinet. He meets with racist problems on the education of African people and Black people within that milieu. And that is why he has to remove that institution to Bettelsdorp. He's given land by a man called Maynier, M-A-Y-N-I-E-R. So of course the institution at Bettelsdorp provided training for Southern African clergy and other scholars. It was opened in 1803, and another followed soon at Caledon in the same region. And the whole region came to be referred to as the Uitenhage, like Oxbridge almost, the Uitenhage, apparently from the then closer name for this region, Etenach. The need of such instruction was so urgent, writes one theorist, that as early as 1802, Van der Kemp felt that the labor of one man should be wholly devoted to the school. At Bettelsdorp, there should be 3 missionaries and 2 schoolmasters. The school met morning and afternoon and was attended by children and adults, though the missionaries were not of one opinion as to whether the adults should be expected to attend. Van der Kemp wisely refused to compel attendance. So these schools were offered as optional. Instruction was confined to reading, writing, and singing. And the yearly reports reveal that despite the principle of non-compulsion, the attendance of adults and children was reasonably good. And most significantly, attendance at school was not dependent on a religious affiliation. In fact, it was used as a means to draw people in. They didn't already have to be Christians. That only happened after the 1870s. All the way, as far as I can see, up to 1870, anybody could walk into any of these schools at any time. So the schools were really quite amazing. Even through 1807, Anderson notes that 80 can read at Rietfontein. Sister Smith, wife of Reverend Smith in Cape Town, has a school. And there were constant calls for cargo of books, which Van der Kemp particularly made and was particularly successful in receiving. Bibles in whole or in part were sent, and really interesting titles as well, world information titles, the kinds of things that we would request people to send us, you know, our handbooks. This is what the information that was in the Institute. And just one quickly thing is to say that one of the schools, the Evangelical magazine covers in 1812, on Tuesday evenings, our religious sister Maria Maritz, of whom Brother Van Kemp has surely made you acquainted, holds a meeting of poor heathens purposefully to teach them to sing hymns in the English manner, which she has learned from Brother Reed when she lived near Bethelsdorf, occasionally dilating on the subject of those hymns in a manner corresponding to the capacity of her hearers. In other words, she's lay preaching, she's preaching, right? It's evangelism work that she's doing there. Now, Maria Morris is interesting because I think she's the daughter of Cupido, who you may want to ask questions about later. Such a lot of information can threaten to derail this entire talk. But I think that she's his daughter. And in 1813, another Fortuin pops up, Geertruide, who is a teacher at Hardcastle, where she has 40 pupils. She's the daughter of Willem, who we met right at the early, who, according to Schumann, who notes the teacher here was Geertruide Fortuin, daughter of Willem Fortuin, who had been Kitcher's interpreter at Sacreville. In July 1816, more than 200 Dutch Bibles, 200 Testaments for the use of Christian Hottentots were sent. They were also supplied Reverend Mr. Latrobe, who was also a Moravian, with more Dutch Testaments for distribution in that country. And so these a lot of the registers are available. Here's one, a report for Bethelsdorf, where you can see day school, an adult Sunday school, school of industry, and an infant school. These have all been started, these ones here have been started after 1820, so I'm not really concerned with them. But 1803 to 1817 is a gap with these registers, which I think will be filled if we can just get the archives to enmesh. I'm very sure we'll be able to track every single student in as much beauty and detail as this register, which comes from 1822 from Bethelsdorf. And I don't know how to express how gorgeous these registers are without tears. I mean, the names, the dates, the small information about their attendance, their marks, you know, somebody's mother's died, somebody's been sent. There's an incredible wealth of information in these registers, similar to the baptism registers that are found for Demerara and the South American situation. So, of course, important in all of this is the question of publishing. How does one publish? Now, in fact, there were lots of printing presses in this region, even from 1799. Letters from between May and June 1799. Oh, yes. Ultimately, this educated, literate population, I should say educated in written literacy rather than just educated as if people didn't have access to other forms of literacy. But here we have a Wesleyan Mission printing establishment document from 1849, 30 years later, where people are actually being asked to pay money to buy their own books of proverbs, scripture. This is a population that now is spending money to purchase texts that they have. That's where this has become a literary want. So what happened with the printing presses? So as early as 1799, there are references to the printing presses. In regard to the printing press we requested, we are advised to make a more particular application. The government has never allowed any private person to print. We shall therefore be necessitated, to our sorrow, to give up, and thank you for the trouble you have taken in purchasing the same. However, one was about to arrive. In 1803, from 1792, I think there's one here already. We have lately received from London a great stack of utensils, among which the principal are a complete press and apparatus to establish a smith shop, likewise a complete cornmill. We want a printer who can remain continually at his work, and a schoolmaster for giving instruction in reading and writing, and likewise the histories of the Bible. They have this printing press already. Then Northcote writes, when not prohibited by government, a printing press was operated, served the needs of the farmers as well as of the institution. But in fact, they do stop them from using the publishing press, the printing press. The printing press arrives. A new printing press has arrived for us at the Cape, but it remains prohibited. And the author writes, I hope and trust they will see the unjustness of this prohibition in a short time, and they will remove it. If not, perhaps a friendly endeavor by you to the Asiatic Committee with a mission of all appearance of complaint and doing it through good friends could be of service. So these missionaries are now, this is Van de Kemp, I think. They are now, it's not Van de Kemp, that's Hitcherer. They are tapping an old boys network to say, come on. And so the separation between the missionaries and colony does start to get very, very blurry, especially when you see that this is the kind of back tapping that can go on, which is sad for me because I always try to think of the missionaries as distinct from colony to see what opportunities.
But maybe the Asiatic Committee is the Asiatic Committee of the mission.
Maybe.
You know, that they're just saying, can't people from another sphere of the mission
Yes.
help us?
Maybe. Maybe. I hope so. That will be good for me. So Schmellen then is also, here's another reference to Helm, who is printing Schmellen's Bechuana languages in 1819. And these guys are in Namaqualand and in Griquatown. In other words, they're virtually at Walvis Bay. But Helm is in Griquatown from 1815 to 1840. So he has definitely got a printing press in Griquatown as well. And he's printing the translations of the Bible into the old Khoikhoi language of the Cape Colony, in inverted commas, Great Namaqualand.
I didn't know anything ever appeared in Khoi languages.
Well, this is what part of my keenness to get this paper to people is to say, I mean, this is just the tip of an iceberg, which I'm going to descend in about 4 minutes to keep on time. So the mission station Bethany in Great Namaqualand was founded by the Reverend Mr. Schmellen in 1814, who left with about 300 people, the station Pella, and trekked north until they came to a beautiful fountain. Amongst the leaders were a whole group of people. In the Namakwa dialect, the 4 Gospels have been translated by the Mr. Schmellen, whose wife, a pious native, was of great assistance to him in this laborious undertaking. They have been printed by the Bible Society. Those are the people who pay for the publication. Her name is Zara.
There's a whole book on her.
Yes, there is. Let me just.
Because of it being an interracial marriage.
Yes. So here's Schmellen's. I'm going to get to that in a second. I'm not talking over you. I'm just bumping you to one side for a second. So here's the Szechuan translation, or parts of the vocabulary. In the special collections downstairs, the vocabulary is not included in the index. It's not visible from the index that there are these pages of a vocabulary here. But this is the whole letter that he writes with the vocabulary attached at the end. You can see it's, you can't even wait to get onto a new page. He starts straight there at the end. This is Schmellen writing. And here's Mrs. Smith saying, no, look, we need a bigger printing press. I received a letter from Brother Evans last month in which he requested me to write to you about a printing press. He informs me that the one they have there is much too small and consequently of little service to them. That as large a one would be much better. And for their would much better answer their purpose. I fear you will think it too expensive to send them one of this description. However, I leave it to your discretion. And she's spelling description and discretion with D-I-S instead of D-E-S. And so those are the kinds of things that as a literary theorist, I'm also looking at how are words being managed by this woman. So Mrs. Smith is also asking for more printing presses. So conventionally, we are taught as students of Southern African print history that the first published printing press to arrive in Southern Africa is in 1823 by the Reverend Richard Ross, who comes from the Scottish Presbyterians with the Glasgow African Missionary Society and begins to transcribe Xhosa. But in fact, this work had been going on for upwards of 20 years by then, 25 years by then. And so, I wonder what happened to my picture of Schmellin's book. I didn't put it in, but yes, there's a book about Zara Schmellin again in the library downstairs, as well as in the special collections, which explains exactly how she was dedicated to the translations. And she dies, the narrative says, a day after she finishes print checking the copies that have arrived from the Bible Society to make sure that the orthography that she invented has been correctly and successfully reproduced. I mean, it's the most insane, as I said, there's so many women in the story, there's a most incredibly empowering situation, aside from the fact that within one day, they travel out of Cape Town for one day in an ox wagon, and they get just past Salt River, for those of us who know Cape Town, and she dies, they say, leaving 4 children, of whom one daughter survives to tell her tale and is really an amazing advocate for her mum. Is the author of not the author of the book, but an author of a biography that Ursula Trooper takes forward. So a really amazing amount of material that has yet to be uncovered. The earliest Xhosa that I found in this is this one, which is from 1799, but I've lost the actual photograph, which means I can't strictly speaking use it, except I'm not yet publishing, so I'll just quickly bring this to you to say, Jesus Christ is intaba thixo inkosi zalizulu, diakuthethe kunika imvula musaphostluiwe. So, I mean, that is not very similar to the Xhosa that I now speak, or that we speak today, but you can hear Jesus Christ is the mountain Thixo, the King of the heavens. I will speak and he will give you rain. Don't be worried. I think this isn't an actual word in Xhosa. I'm not exactly sure what it might be. Don't be ground. Don't be done down. Don't worry about the fact that the rain, who's going to bring rain is a major issue that runs all the time. This is the earliest representation of the vernacular Xhosa that I found, 1799. But here is an even earlier rendition of the Our Father in the Khoi language. And it's published in this particular text in 1743. And in fact, this chapter here, to Leibniz from Dora, a Khoi prayer in the Republic of Letters, shows the eminence to which literary historians of the 18th century held this language. They published not only the Lord's Prayer, which is published, you can see there's the Dutch and here's the language that they're transcribing into, which I'm not exactly sure which one it is. I think it's Hessequa, but I could be wrong and I don't want to say for sure. It was republished in 1768. I found it in a book here, documenting and researching Southern Africa, aspects and essays in honor of Carl Schlettwein.
Schlettwein is the guy who started the Basel Africa Bibliographie. He's the Namibian mogul who had the money to start that whole fandango that happens in Basel.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is part of his litany or his legacy. It's published again in 1768, and then in 1797, it's also reproduced with 10 Commandments and the Apostles' Creed. And here they are, the Ten Commandments and the Apostles' Creed. And I have these links, so if you want them, I'm really happy to send them because to my mind, this is absolutely revolutionary knowledge. Even though if your name is Gerald Grunewald, yes, Gerald de Grunewald, it's definitely not new knowledge. This paper was written in 2004, where he's talking about the entrance of these very people to the Republic of Letters. This is the lettered version of their reality, which is already upheld by experts in this field. We are actually late to this, well, I should say me, late to this story. So, the Arbeitsatze and pupils. So, we say this paper is supposed to end on a call to beseech us to read further archives going forward. And one theorist argues, of all linguistics composed, many have been lost, and all that is left today are occasional allusions in contemporary literature, historical documents, and private correspondence. A good example is what one could style the case van Grevenbroek for the published Hottentot remnants in early 18th century scholarship. Both Hiob Ludolf and Gottfried Leibniz had specimens of this language in their possessions. The unfortunate fact is that there are several good reasons to believe that van Groevenberg composed a very detailed and worthwhile description of Khoi culture, but that the manuscript never reached the printer and is now irretrievably lost. So for me, that's not a fact, it's an opinion. I myself will continue to search. And I'll research not only in the Dutch archives, because as I said, it seems to me that looking in English archives is just too little. We'll also be looking at the French Rhenish missions, Wuppertal, for example. Extremely racist. If you open this book, your glasses will be thrown off your nose within 14 seconds. But underneath that information is information about this group of writers, which I sift through to get there. So the Rhenish missions, the United Evangelical Mission in Wuppertal, which has the story of Hannah Kleinschmidt, Schmellen, Hannah Schmellen, who's the daughter of the Zara, who's the writer. Her stuff is there at the Rhenish. And also the Dutch, the Paris Evangelical Missionary Society, where Eugene Cassalis was working, all the Berlin Missionary Society archives with Kropf, who was at Stutterheim, otherwise known as Tumakala for those of my South African listeners. There is in fact an infinity of possibility of what South African literary issue in this time. Yeah. Thank you so much for listening. I've been waiting to tell you this information for about 2 years.
Amazing research.
To get us out of this. We're still recording for the time being, at least. And well, thank you very much for our audience, both here in the SOAS and online, and everybody who's going to be listening to this. So in advance, if you have questions that we cannot discuss this evening or that you think of later once it's finished, then please write to us and we'll try to respond. But first of all, Joe, thank you very much. For me, it's been equal because you've been on my list of speakers for at least since COVID ended.
Yes, I know.
And then you said, oh, it's not complete yet. I still have to do that. And then life intervenes and so on. So I'm really happy that this is now done. So, and this is, of course, we also look forward to the book that will grow out of this, because this is the very important contribution that you will be making. And then, for those of you who don't know, we're also trying to create a hands-on course for the archives that we have in the here at SOAS. And many of these archival sources you've referred to in your lecture, they are witnesses, they're products of their time. So they will speak in the language of their time. They will, when we teach our children, I was going to say, our first year students, the how to use archives, how to approach archives. We have there's one unit that it talks about decolonizing archives. And what it means is you look at the sources that you have on Africa, on Asia, because this is the School of Asian and African Studies, but it would be the same if you went to other places that focus on South America, for example. So you try to understand the colonizer, you also try to understand the colonized, because most of the sources that we get are from the colonizer. So you have to read between the lines. You have to decode what they are writing. I talk too much. Questions to our speaker.
Right. I wonder how much the listeners here appreciate that you are actually now talking about, to my mind, a sort of completely different group of people from what you have worked on before.
Yes.
That you have worked on Xhosa speakers, Africans in the Eastern Cape, and this is to do with the original inhabitants of the Western Cape, the people who were called Hottentots and Bushmen in the old textbooks that we grew up on in South Africa. And they are a much more mixed group, or become a much more mixed interstitial kind of group. And as you said, the divisions are not, there's a lot of fluidity, the divisions are not rigid.
Yes.
So that in an area around modern day Gqeberha or Port Elizabeth,
Which is where Bethelsdorp is.
yeah, the people of the Western Cape and the Africans of the Eastern Cape, the indigenous people who, you know, kind of Mandela's lot, and kind of Cape brown people who are actually a little bit different and have different languages. There is an overlap, and they mix and mingle in, and that's where the Guna-Kwebi are, I think. But what becomes clear from what you've said is that this group of people in the Western Cape, who are the first people the Dutch encounter, themselves become the middlemen and middlewomen. They become the interpreters and the translators, that they have Dutch, they have their original Hottentot languages, the Gonakwa and the Esekwan, these languages that have gone. You know, Xhosa hasn't gone. The African languages from the Eastern Cape and from Zululand, those languages are still there. But the languages further west have gone.
Well, unless we can retrieve them from these,
people are trying to retrieve them.
Deposits. I mean, it is possible. Sorry, Debbie, I interrupted you.
But so what I think is fascinating about what you're looking at now is the way these initial contacts with the missionaries themselves become key translators, and that they make possible the evangelization inland.
Absolutely.
You know, and there is some intermarriage beginning, so that, you know, the so-called coloured people of the Western Cape are the outcome of relationships between Hottentots, Bushmen, Dutch, English,
German.
you know, so it's a much more confused and multilingual situation. But I had no idea that there were all these letters. One of the things I wondered about was, is there any dictating of letters going on? How sure are you that everything from Dorothea or whatever is written by Dorothea, are some of these things not dictated to missionary sort of amanuenses or whatever?
So the reason I say I'm sure is because each author I have a different reason for.
Right.
Okay, so with Brother Scholz's writing, Jacobus Scholz, you can track the development of his hand from 1803 all the way through to 1817 as it operates in Dutch and in English. So if you I write in more than one language, my handwriting changes when I come to write in French or when I come to write in Xhosa or Afrikaans or whatever, my handwriting will shift. I don't know why, but it does.
Yeah.
It's not uniform. And the same thing is happening with Scholz. The reason I can say for sure that I think Martha and Mary are writing their letters is because they write them in Dutch, and then those are translated into English, and there's more than one instance of their letters so that I can compare the handwriting. I mean, I wouldn't go to a court of law or, you know, to a block, but I'm pretty very certain. Catherine Dorothea Fortuyn, I believe, is writing herself because she is already the word worker in the family. She, the story behind her, there's so many amazing stories. The story behind her is that Willem Pieter Fortuyn, her husband, finds Edwards and Edmund when they just arrived in 1799 and they want to go inland to Roodersand. And he says, I'll take you there, or drive your wagon, and once we've got you there, I'll go back and pick up my wife, Katerina, and she's going to do the translation work for you. So I think he's got, like, he wants to go to Roodersand himself. He has his own eye on something. But it's clear all the way from the first meeting that he's referring to her as the person that they need. So she's the word worker, and then he does like odd jobs, drives the wagon, builds the odd thing, does a bit of gardening. He's around as a kind of groundsman or a very important person in acclimatizing, getting water, but she's the word worker. And as far as I can tell, because there is this history of education that's going on since 1736 with those original things, those original students, there's a dispersion of illiteracy across the whole region, and not only by colony, but also by these farmers like Van Zilk, who have this kind of thing that they're also going to have a school on their farm, and that, you know, that there are a few who have some form of the milk of human kindness in themselves. So there's a spread of information, and there's also a spread of a Christocentric message. And that is where my original research was geared towards, to understand how Soga inherited a Christian message, not begatted himself, to see him as a legatee rather than a person making a legacy.
That sort of Christian teaching is knocking around the region.
For 100 years. Soga is born in, a disputed date between 1829 and 31. This is 100 years after Genadendal or Baviaans Kloof was made. And I can't find any prior notice of education in that small region of Cape Colony that existed until 1726. It's not at the Jan van Riebeck's diaries. It's not in any of the documents around there that I've seen. So I think Schmidt is the first, but it's such a strong beginning, and it's picked up that in fact it spreads really quickly. People pass on the skill and the Christianity that they use, the theology that they make, because Schmidt lives under this sacramental cloud dust.
He's baptized. Baptized indigenous.
He baptizes 6 people in 1742, and then he gets called to Cape Town to account for how he's done this, and they call into question his ordination credentials. So he goes back to Europe, and although that is cleared up, He's such an amazing man, you know, he's thrown into jail. Do you know about him? He's thrown into jail in Moravia for being a Protestant with his friend. And they're in jail for 4 years and his friend dies. Whereupon Schmidt decides he's translating to Catholicism, becomes Catholic, renounces Presbyterianism in the jail, becomes Catholic, they set him free. He goes back to his Moravian, his old group denomination, and they chase him out. They say, how could you have done that? You have lied, you know, there's blasphemy. So they chase him out and he ends up with Zinzendorf at the Moravian, at Hirwitz.
Right.
And Zinzendorf absolutely adores him and thinks he's absolutely amazing. And he's the 3rd missionary to be sent out. The other 2 earlier than he are going to America, which is now, I think, New York, and then one to New York and one to South America. And those are the original Moravians.
I mean, it just reminds me of you know, the brutality that you describe about the Dutch who arrive and they kill the locals. This is also the time when Europe pretty much annihilated itself.
Yes, yes.
30 years war that was
Yes.
and I mean I grew up in Sweden, so all of my early readings, they were about the 30 Years War, the heroic wars and so on, but what the soldiers did and what they that is
Brutal times in Europe too, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
not to the soldiers but to the civilian populations. That was it's unbelievable, and it's this brutalizing force of war. So yeah, it's this is very bad. This is it's, I think it's, if you, because of the mass media, because of computerized you know, programs with sort of everything's been sanitized, you know, there's no blood. There's no, that's, but the blood is there, it's in these books, you know, it's you open the book.
And like the punishment of slaves, you know, because the Cape had slaves as well, which students were always surprised to learn from me that the Cape had slaves, and the punishment for slaves who stepped out of line were disgusting.
Were the Dutch slaves sent to Batavia?
They came from Batavia.
They came from Batavia.
We got slaves from Batavia,
Okay.
which is Jakarta.
Yes. But the strange thing in Batavia later, the slaves have they're often set free. They become integrated. Those are, there's like a twofold.
Cross-pollination, yes, probably.
No, but I mean, in fact, the slaves that get brought to the Cape by the Dutch are some of them from Madagascar and Mozambique. And the ones who come from Indonesia are sort of political prisoners or kind of
Indentured laborers.
Well, the ones that come are sometimes clerics who've fallen out of favor and get exiled to the Cape. But I'm not a specialist on the slave period, but yeah. But yeah, so the Western Cape is complicated because you've got these indigenous people and you've got slaves and you've got the Dutch settlers. Yeah.
It's
a virtual Babel.
questions more. No.
Oh, I have a question.
Yeah.
Please. At the beginning, you said about the pejorative names, or when you showed us the map.
Yes.
In these writings, are there alternative ones?
Yes.
For the peoples that, you know, or for the spaces and places that have survived. So we know that they themselves had, they used the pejorative name, they called the place whatever it was called, or they called themselves something else.
But there is a double nomenclature that runs through the scripts, through the sources, yes, especially in the early periods. What I am familiar, very familiar with 1736 up to 1808, 1812 with the actual sources. And But as soon as the missionaries become used to their word, they only use that with the variant spellings and renditions, so that Boschesman can be spelled Boschesman,
Bosman, yeah.
or Bosman, or any kind of pronunciation that a person would bring to their normal spoken is written down. But I have managed, I didn't bring it here, but I have managed to find names of most rivers, mountains, deserts, which I have on another map of the Western Cape, of the Eastern Cape, specifically with Tulsa. But those names are recorded, yes, in the spellings and the orthographies that the missionaries at the time used to transcribe them. So I don't know if that in any way reflects the way that it would have been spoken or spelled by the people themselves, but it is possible, yes, to tell what the naming system of the people who lived there originally used. It is possible. That would be a very important part of it.
No, I'm just curious in terms of this literary heritage.
Yes.
To what extent if you think of it as a form of resistance or agency, to what extent people try to maintain, to say, because of course you're aware it's pejorative.
Yes.
It's not like you're not aware.
Of course.
But at what cost can you maintain or try to teach to the next generation that we have two names? They have this name that is racist or whatever that has been brought in.
Yeah.
But there's this is what we call it, and this is what its meaning is. Because I mean, just think of other work I've done, but I haven't worked on religion per se. What often comes up is not in terms of racism, but in terms of the names are loaded with not just their literal meaning, but also they hold a cosmology,
Yes.
another way of relating
Absolutely.
to the land, to each other.
They're like portals.
Yeah, so in this conversion to Christianity, communities go through periods, or even still to this day, maintain both systems.
Yes.
And one of the ways it's done is through names.
Yes.
And so I'm just curious to what extent, if you've seen any ways in which people still maintain the names or baptize with both names or things like that.
I mean, baptism registers that I've seen usually use the name, especially in the early period. Mary, Martha, and John are the first anglicized names that are found. So that there are a few important families like the Waterboers and the Cox. There's a theorist called Martin Legassic who wrote about these communities much more than I did, but not from a religious perspective, only a political perspective. They had power in both domains, religion, and I actually have a slide about this, thinking that a similar question might come up. So those names are not, a lot of them are sort of Dutchified or anglicized.
Dutch or Afrikaans names.
Yes, but they're also like the children are named names that would speak of a different culture from a different language. So there is both. Both naming systems are resident in the baptismal registers. But one thing that your question is leading me to think about, which is a question which is one of the reasons that once you said to me, "Are you ready?" and I said 95%.
Yeah.
One question which has been bothering me is the fact that most theorists who work on these people from 1803 up, which is only about 10, find that or argue that the people who are using or claiming to be Christians, not necessarily, they don't even call them converts, they say people who are claiming to be Christians, derive respectability from their positions as Christians in the communities in which they exist. And when I gave a paper on the Southern African clergy who are found in these sources, so Scholz is the last, there's another called Jan Matthijs Kok, who is previously, and I think I can now, further to this research, exactly pinpoint where his congregation was in 1770. One of the questions was asked me, what about this respectability thing? What do you have to say on respectability? And I've always said, I said at the time, I don't agree that any of these people achieved any kind of respectability through any kind of Anglicization or Dutchification, if that is such a word. And I don't agree that they achieved any kind of respectability through their access to churches either, because some of them were clergy, they gave baptisms, they married peoples. I don't believe that they ever achieved respectability either, because their lives were in constant danger. They were constantly terrified of being murdered any single second that could happen, like right now. So I don't, the need to take English names or the wish to use more nomenclatures than the one that you already had was nil in my mind. The way I'm reading, there was no gain to be made by looping a name onto another naming system. Do you know what I'm saying? Nobody seems to have had any advantage by that. Their lives were just as in peril. And that, as I've said, I'm sorry, I'm just going off there. But as I've said, every now and again, you'll get this narrative. It's like Shakespeare, exit followed by bear, you know? Mm-hmm. Every now and again, you get this thing where so-and-so disappeared, murdered that day, or shortly after murdered. And in fact, although I dispute that that's actually what's happened to those men, it could have. So retaining the key to that cosmology was never, in my reading of the situation, something that people stopped doing. I think they continually did it. We just need to trace it, and I think we'll find it. Long answer to a question.
Yes, well, just going on with the namings, you know, it's like the bastard Hottentot that was in a lot of the pages. Like,
yes.
Do you know anything about?
Yes, I do. So bastard Hottentot is in fact
Buster, they're sometimes called.
Yes.
And yeah, and that's through mixed relationships.
So actually,
kind of white farmers and brown women.
Mixed, okay.
But the naming of them as bastards is the subject of Jared MacDonald's work.
Okay.
And you want to borrow my book? He writes about how these names came to be invented. Bastard Hottentot is a name that is invented by ethnographers specifically to uphold the writing that they're doing because they don't know. And they actually come out and say in their work in the 19th century, we don't know what we're talking about, so we're going to just use this word. Right. And in fact, it's not even true that that is a miscegenated community necessarily anymore. The word bastard in that way, or bastard, referred to what was a color inflector that meant not black.
Right.
So
more mixed race looking.
But it didn't necessarily mean mixed race. Right. That's the pejorative meaning that we now know. But this is also where I get very stressed out about the whole thing about respectability, because these bastard Hottentots are the ones who theorists claim have the most respectability in their communities, but they are called this pejorative name, which, as you say, we will always know is pejorative. You can't know it, you can't pretend it's not. You always know, including even in the 19th century. So the categorization around those names is the subject of contemporary research on exactly these subjects, and newness is being brokered as we speak.
Could you talk a little bit more about your imagery?
So
so Jared studied with Wayne Dooling.
Did he?
Yes, his PhD was done here, I thought.
So Jared's work is just incredibly useful. I mean, he's so interesting. I do have a number of issues with his work, and particularly in this book, I wish he had given me the manuscript so I could edit it before, because there are some glaring spelling mistakes. Shouldn't be there.
Wayne will be listening to this. He's in South Africa at the moment.
I think Jared was Wayne's student.
It's possible.
Possible.
2023, well, that could be, yes.
So these are clergy, Johannes Narken, Lehrer und Missionshofster in Silo. That means reader and mission hand in Silo. This is a missionary station really close to where Theo Sorga lived and did his thing. And you see how handsome, how gorgeous are these men. I mean, they are just so, this man, Joshua Hermanus, he's a Dolmeischer, that means he's a deacon.
Yes.
In Silo. And these are from the 1840s, the Moravian archives. The Moravians have the most insane amount of information. So Karel Stompia is Wilhelmina's husband. She has two husbands. Her first husband is a renegade Boer called Buys. And if Mputomi is still
linked to Conrad Bates.
yes, if Mputomi is still on, then he will have something to say, because he has written a very interesting article about Conrad Buys. So Karel Stompia is her second husband. And I don't know where Boone got this picture from, other than from the Moravian archives themselves. And as I say, I was hoping to go there, and then COVID happened, and then all sorts of other things have happened, and I still haven't gone there. But I would love to, because I have a feeling that a huge key, more portals to the Southern African historical reality lie in, I mean, they have even this is here in Huts in the south of Germany on the Transylvanian border.
I've been.
Have you?
Yes.
It's what's out this.
Went to a conference there.
Yeah. And these are just maps of that I put in the presentation, just to remind us that we are working in a century which is now 400 years ago. I would say.
Yeah.
2025 minus 300 is 1725. And we are so used to the map of Southern Africa, speaking of colonization and speaking of white imperial venture, that to look at it as a landmass without borders, or with borders that are completely different to the ones we're used to now, reminds us it's a different situation. And also that people could move quickly between their zones.
Yeah.
They weren't stuck. It wasn't like you were stuck in the Namaqualand and then 4 years later you would find, it wasn't like the wild prairies of America.
Yeah. Wow.
No.
Out of use.
In the documentation and the
I
books.
think the map is really important.
So please have a look and see. Yes, please. Jared MacDonald has a very important book, a chapter in that book as well. This is what I was going to say about the information that the Schmellens were publishing, and that I think we'll find in the Dutch. This is Unbroken String, which is work related to the Blicks. As Will Calento has told me I have to say the word, because I always called them the Blicks. And then he said to me, you know, you have to say that Blick.
Or aren't they Blake or something, almost
So
Blake.
these aren't the blokes who are in Unbroken String, but these are the people with whom, similar people with whom the Blakes were working. And this is what this information looks like in the contemporary era. I think this book is 10 years old. The Keeper of the Kum by Sylvia von Neuhofen, an incredibly powerful book about the Outeniqua region, which is where Schmidt was originally, very close to Baviaanskloof. How
Fiction or?
it's autobiography. It's a story of how she becomes ill. It's a bit of a trope. A person becomes ill. They don't know what's wrong with them. The ancestors are calling. She has to accept the ancestors. She has to wrestle with the fact of the ancestors. And then the information, which is the Kum, the information comes in and she becomes the keeper of the Kum. This is the most beautiful, incredible, powerful book, other than all the other beautiful, incredible, powerful books. But the reason I brought these books is to say the traffic in this knowledge is valuable. it's never been treated as valueless. It's always had a monetized, commercial value. I actually lent that book to a friend of mine who was traveling in that region, and she said it got too powerful, she couldn't read it. Because she was right in the middle with all the paintings, because there's also paintings in the stove. So she was right there, and she said she had a bit of an epiphany because it was so hot. It was 34 degrees, and she was there with one guide who was like an aging Afrikaans man who basically was going to die any second himself, and her friend who came from the Bobels, and so they had to abandon mission. But yeah, it's really, I mean, it's a valuable information, and yeah. This is a very rare book, The Broken String. I hardly know another version of it. I looked for it in other places, and I bought it in Cape Town about 30 years ago, and I've never seen it since. And it's another version of the Bleak stories without the Bleaks involved.
Right.
Thanks, yeah.
Anyway, I know you have to run because you've
Yes.
been working since early this morning.
Okay, thank you. I think officially we draw the line here. Thank you 10,000 times for this wonderful lecture, and for everyone who is here, the next seminar of the center will be after the summer break, so you'll find an announcement. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you as well for being here for us. And
Thank you for having me. I'm so grateful. Just wonderful to share this work with you, because otherwise it sits in my brain and nobody knows other than me. I'm also at the table going like,
Joe Ichimura knows because you're finding things in the archive.
yes, and actually I moved too fast for Jo, which is part of the reason. She asked me, can you just keep a list of what you're finding? Because she